This is Teddy Roosevelt, just back from charging up San Juan Hill. Damn it, Professor Buzzkill was already at the top, collecting historical evidence, busting myths, and taking names. I have to admit that he's a worthy competitor, and a damn fine Rough Rider. Join me in listening to this episode. It's sure to be bully.
Yes, Professor Buzzkill, here we are once again, and we talked last week about the Versailles Treaty. Professor Nash is here with us to help continue that because it's so important. It's the 100th year anniversary and is not well known enough in the sort of popular history world, and certainly don't learn enough about it in our schools. But we didn't have time, of course, last week to talk about the USA and the Versailles Treaty. So, Professor, you're here for that, right?
Sure, we can talk about that.
Thanks for coming back. Thanks for traveling, making this arduous journey.
My pleasure. I went through several checkpoints on the way here.
That's right.
But I made it. My papers are in good order. Happy to announce.
Papers, please. And it's so complicated, yet so significant for so long in the 20th century.
Right, absolutely. And so we talked about some of the terms.
Yeah, right.
And the
terms
of
the treaty, meaning
right.
what was supposed to happen.
Right, like territorial changes, and also
right.
the ways in which Germany was punished and sort of restricted by the treaty. But
again, 1919. Before
right,
we
1919.
Forget,
we're talking about now. And let me just remind folks about how you had this tension within the victorious Allied camp, that Wilson was sort of resented by the British and the French.
Yeah.
And the feeling was sort of mutual. They have different visions for the future. They have different priorities.
Yeah.
But in long story short, Wilson in the treaty, if you look at its terms, if you look at what he wanted a very idealistic peace.
Yes.
And this was not his plan, but this actually made things worse in Germany, because a lot of Germans in their wishful thinking believed that the peace would be the Wilsonian peace. And then when they see they actually have public protests. In fact, I just saw a picture of a public protest in Germany when the terms were announced.
Okay.
And a huge crowd, and they had this big banner that said, "Only the 14 points."
Oh, which is the Wilsonian peace.
In other words, they felt like they had been lied to.
Yeah.
Now, of course, like I said, this is partly self-deception.
Yeah.
And naivete, but they lost the war, and so they want the best peace possible, and so they really like what Woodrow Wilson is selling. And then they look at the terms of the treaty, and they're like, well, "Wait a minute now,
yeah,
this is not peace without victory. This is an old school peace, right? This is like peace with plenty of victory."
Yeah.
And basically, because of the political reality, Wilson is.
By the way, we're going to try to find images of that Buzzkillers and put it on the website. Going to tweet it and put it in the video.
Yeah,
if we can, gotta make sure we get the right ones.
Right. Yeah, there were mass demonstrations in Germany that this was so outrageous. Now, once again, that doesn't mean those people are right, and we'll talk about that in a minute.
No, sure, yeah.
But their outrage is genuine, and the resentment. But Wilson, because of political reality, is forced to compromise on the punitive aspects of the peace, right? The territorial losses, the reparations, etc., the war guilt, all those things. And Wilson, to his credit, he is very concerned about the traditional cycle of war and peace, where one side wins a war, punishes the losing side, and by punishing the losing side, plants the seeds for the next war. He understood that dynamic, I think, better than a lot of people did. And he deserves some credit for trying to break that cycle.
Yeah,
he failed. The good news for him is that he did get his League of Nations.
Yeah, and that's a big deal.
It's a big deal that the other allies didn't necessarily have to agree to it. They did. They agreed to have it put in the treaty. It is his dream. It's also, when the reality of the treaty becomes clear, in his mind, it's sort of his insurance policy, which is to say,
I don't think of it that way.
Even if the other terms of this treaty plant the seeds for the next war, we're good, because we're going to have this international organization called the League of Nations.
Oh, they'll hash
which
things
will,
out.
Any would-be aggressor, say if Germany revives and goes on the warpath again, the League will be in place to keep them in check and to prevent a World War II.
Oh, I never think of the League that way, but you're absolutely right.
That's in a way that's sort of the genius of Wilson's idea. Here's the problem: he, like the others, is in a democracy, and in our democracy, treaties only become law if 2/3 of the U.S. Senate ratifies.
Yeah.
We won't go into all the details, but basically, partly because he was not so effective a domestic politician, and the Republicans won the 1918 midterm elections. in the United
pesky
States,
midterms, yeah.
giving control of the U.S. Senate to the Republican Party, whom he
Yeah.
had not included in the treaty writing process. And by the way, fast
mistake.
forward to 1945, Franklin Roosevelt's going to be very careful to include leading Republicans in his delegation to the San Francisco Conference.
Sure.
Learning from history,
Yeah,
which
that's
is what we always love to see. But he's very self-righteous. He's very arrogant.
That's another Wilsonian thing.
Oh my God! And I'm not exaggerating. He really believed he was doing God's work on earth.
Yes.
And so, as I like to tell my students, when the stone tablets are handed down, you don't say, "Well, we need to edit these."
Yeah, that's right.
And so there are Republicans who worry, and we don't know because we never joined the League. We don't know how this would have worked out. But Republicans worry that the language of the League might commit the United States to war in the future, a war to preserve the peace, in other words, right? In other words, if you have an act of aggression and the United States is on the League Council, that we will have no choice, right? In other words, our freedom of movement in international affairs will be curtailed.
So it's not just isolationism. It's not just isolationism. It is a sort of, look, if the League votes for a war we don't want to be part of, that's a very serious thing.
Thank you for pointing that out. That's an important distinction. These are not isolationists.
Yes, the people who oppose the treaty.
Some of the very careful history about this would call these people independent internationalists. In other words, they are perfectly open to the United States playing an international role, but not on a permanent and sort of coercive basis, which is what the League, in their view, seems to suggest. And so they call people like Henry Cabot Lodge, who was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and believed that he should be president. He
a lot of people like that.
So partly this is a personal thing between he and Wilson. He believes that the League covenant should be modified.
Right.
So long story short, neither the League unmodified nor the League with its reservations gets 2/3 of a vote. It gets 2/3 of the votes in the Senate. It fails. It has a couple of versions. At least one version gets a simple majority, but not a 2/3 majority.
Oh, so it fails on more than one.
On multiple votes, it fails. There are also these so-called irreconcilables, a group of 12 to 18 senators who oppose the League in any form. And then there are Wilson loyalists who refuse to go along with any reservations, and then you've got the Republicans. Anyway, so long story short, the treaty fails in the United States, and it's the great irony. The League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles go into effect, but the United States is not a member of the organization that it promoted.
Yeah, not a member of Wilson's great dream.
Right. And by the way, if you're wondering, okay, then what? The United States then has to negotiate separate bilateral peace treaties with the Central Powers.
Oh, Lordy, that must have taken the rest of
it's not until like 1921 are those actually those locked down.
Well, I mentioned a minute ago that a lot of the Senate Republicans were not necessarily isolationists, but does this whole thing kind of mean the U.S. retreats into its shell?
No. In fact, I'm gonna use this moment to explode what I call the myth of U.S. isolationism.
Yes,
this is old news to most historians of U.S. foreign relations, but I think in the public there's still this concept that World War II happened because we crawled back into our shell and became isolationist.
Yeah.
Now, it's maybe not a myth. It's a half-truth. I'll put it that way.
Okay.
Yes, we didn't join the League of Nations.
Okay.
Yes, the League was weaker because of that.
Yeah.
Yes, the United States did not play a role in stopping German and Japanese aggression in the 1930s.
Now, this is something we need to remind ourselves of when we have the anti-French or anti-appeasement crowd and the anti-French crowd. The U.S. did not stop German and Japanese aggression either.
Allow me to quote the entirety of Franklin Roosevelt's cable to Neville Chamberlain after the Munich conference in 1938, and I'm quoting, "Good man."
Yeah, right.
Okay, that's the United States. That's not a United States that wants to do the right thing or is in a position to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Now, partly this was about Congress. Partly this was about isolationist sentiment. There was a lot of that.
Yeah.
A lot of the United States, a lot of people in America thought we had been played by World War I. We wanted to avoid that again.
Yeah.
There were the conspiracy theories about the arms merchants, the sort of merchants of deaths, and the bankers who schemed to get us into World War I, and we just didn't want to go down that road again. The United States didn't join World War II until 1941, right?
Yeah, the end of 1941.
Right, so yes, we were isolationist in a lot of ways. However, most historians today are quite clear on the other ways in which we were not isolationist. We were very active in arms control efforts. In the 1920s especially. We hosted the Washington Naval Conference, which was one of the most successful arms control agreements ever.
Yeah, that's right.
1921-22. We were very active economically and culturally.
Right.
Around the world, our presence was felt. We played a big political role in Europe with things like the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan, right? We played a leading role in renegotiating German reparations payments, which helped buy us some additional years of peace and stability in the 1920s and going into the 1930s. So we were not isolationist. We were active. We were certainly active in Latin America in the 1920s and 1930s.
Right.
Where we seemed to send the Marines in every 5 minutes, including in the 1920s.
Well, yeah. It's sad, but it's true. Yeah.
So, I mean, we're not isolationists in that sense. So that really is sort of a canard that we crawled back into our shell. So and like I said, and even in Europe, we played an active role. Often it was informal. Like I said, we weren't a member of the League, but we were not absent. And we had the economic strength and the resulting political clout to really be a player in a lot of these international conferences on arms control and other issues as well.
Wilson, of course, by this stage is dead, right?
Yeah, he died. Yeah, he's out of office 1921. He by the way, I forgot to tell the other part that he about the League struggle inside the United States. He basically took the struggle to the people. He thought he could get popular support to blast the Republicans in Congress out of his way. And he basically wrecked his health in the process. He suffered a near-fatal stroke early October 1919. He's never the same. He's never really fully in charge as president after that. Although that's also a mini myth that his wife was running the country. That's not true.
No.
But he was sort of incapacitated and not an effective political leader. He became even more sort of rigid and uncompromising.
But originally he fears this sowing the seeds of another war.
Right.
If there's a harsh peace.
Right.
What, did he turn out to be right?
Right. Because a minute ago I kind of implied that he was sort of.
Yeah.
And this is something else I would say is not entirely false, but I think it's greatly exaggerated.
Mm-hmm.
So he's right to some extent. Recent historians believe that the Versailles Peace was not nearly as harsh as a lot of people thought. And for example, I mentioned I was going to trash John Maynard Keynes. By the way, I'm a huge fan of Keynes. He was brilliant.
Again, the British economist.
He's the one who understood. Well, he founded Keynesian economics, which has often proved its usefulness. It effectively ended the Great Depression in countries like the United States. And that was all Keynesian. Keynesian economic spending can be an amazing thing. Anyway, he immediately, because he was involved on the British team at Versailles, and he immediately warned about a punitive peace sowing the seeds for the next war that was going to wreck Germany and lead to all sorts of resentment. I'm pretty sure that he referred to the peace as Carthaginian.
Right. Now, Buzzkill should know that
Carthage loses one of the wars.
And then
the Rome basically lays waste to Carthage and sows salt into the soil. That's the detail I always remember. Whether that's true or not, I don't know.
Actually, we don't do ancient history on this show, but we should look into stuff like that.
Some ancient historian is now screaming at us.
There isn't that much salt in the Roman Empire.
You need to do a show on Carthage. But
actually, we do have people complain we don't do ancient history, so there you go.
Well, there you go. But especially people like people in Britain agreed with Keynes very quickly.
Yeah, and
immediately had second thoughts that this well, I'll put it this way: that the treaty was too French, that it was too harsh, that it was too punitive, that all you've done is you have caused German resentment, you have garnered sympathy for the Germans they don't deserve, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I have several points I'd like to make on this score to sort of complicate the picture of how harsh the Versailles Treaty was toward Germany.
And complicate the picture for us again here in the Institute is good because history, we keep trying to get across the idea that this is extremely complicated and people should understand that.
Yes, I'm not doing this gratuitously.
No.
I don't sit around, how can we make this simple thing more complicated?
Yeah.
That is not my goal. My goal is to capture the complexity, which I would argue is objectively there.
Right.
So one obvious point is that many Germans perceive the Versailles Treaty to be harsh, whether or not it was actually harsh by any reasonable standard. And this is partly because of the strength of German nationalism.
Right.
Keep in mind that German nationalists were all about World War I, and they were all about winning World War I, and all about imposing a peace like this on other people who lost.
Oh, okay.
So in other words, the gap between what a German nationalist wants and what they actually get is huge. It is a yawning gap. And so what I'm saying here is that even a milder peace would also have been resented by German nationalists. In other words, the slightest territorial concession, even moderate reparation payments, even a moderate reduction of the German military, or even giving up just a few of your overseas colonies, all of these would have driven most German nationalists around the bend as unacceptable.
Okay, so this means that the German nationalists, of course, in the 20s and in the early 30s, complain about their own politicians having stabbed Germany in the back at Versailles.
That's right.
But even if they hadn't agreed to, even if they'd agreed to much milder terms, they would have still been accused of stabbing themselves in Germany in the back.
And not just people like Adolf Hitler, but a lot of people further to the center from him. There was no satisfying these people. Basically, they basically could not get over the fact that Germany had lost, and that there was going to be some pain involved in that. And what I'm saying here is, in one sense, it really doesn't matter the precise level of the pain.
Yeah,
every bit of pain they felt like it was an amputation.
Wow.
And then they are going to become single issue voters in the 20s, and they're going to stop at nothing to get some revenge for this.
Well, and again, this is disheartening to anyone who thinks there are simple answers to these things, and it just shows that they're in immense complications.
Right. Well, and I think it's an important qualification, because I think often Versailles is portrayed as Germans were rightly upset about how harsh this peace was. And I'm saying they're upset regardless of the actual terms.
Right.
Those are not necessarily connected, or at least not connected 100%.
Because, I mean, moderate Germans, sensible Germans would argue that the war was really a stalemate, or in many ways a stalemate.
Right.
We should just be a continued.
No, and that's partly on the German militarists who had a news blackout, and all Germans knew is that we're winning, our troops are still in France, and all of a sudden we lose.
Yeah.
And so then in that sort of news vacuum, stab in the back myth fills in, and then gets wedded to this already existing extreme German nationalism, which was very widespread. And so that makes any peace terms would have caused outrage. A second sort of mitigating or sort of complicating factor here is that there were allies who sought even harsher terms.
Yeah,
so,
especially French.
In a way, I've oversimplified it. There wasn't even just a French point of view. You had someone like Ferdinand Foch, who was the Supreme Allied Commander at the end of the war. He wanted France to permanently occupy all of the Rhineland, if not actually annex it. In other words, all of German territory to the west of the Rhine River.
Yeah.
In other words, he wanted a permanent buffer zone to protect France from Germany. A buffer zone consisting of German territory.
Yeah, right.
That would have caused much more resentment, and is a much more extreme sort of maximalist goal for the French. But they didn't do that. Mm-hmm. To put it another way, my third point would be that the terms were less harsh than German terms which were imposed on Russia at Brest-Litovsk, right? In other words, we don't entirely have to run the what-if scenario. What if Germany would have won the war? They won the war in the East.
True. True.
They basically lopped off a territory which included a third of the Russian Empire's population.
Yeah.
They turned Ukraine and the Baltic states and what's called Congress Poland, in other words, the sort of geographic core of Poland, made those into vassal states.
Right, true.
And by the way, they also imposed reparations on the Russians.
Yeah.
So, on the one hand, it's a little rich for Germans to say, well, this is so unfair. Look at all these nasty things you're doing. Yeah. Well, this is exactly what you did in Russia. And by the way, we have documents that spell out German plans for victory in the West as well. Belgium would have become a vassal state. They would have created the equivalent of an economic EU completely dominated by Germany.
Yeah.
I believe even the French, there was some talk about making France sort of an economic vassal state of Germany. In other words, it's not like Germany is the Red Cross and the Allies are so nasty with their peace terms. Not even close.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
That's mitigating. Fourth, Germany was not occupied or dismembered.
Yes, that's a very important fact.
The reparations were dialed back on more than one occasion, and were obviously not so bad that they prevented the economic boom of the late 1920s. So in a way, the Germans were protesting they helped cause a lot of the chaos early in the 1920s, but that's partly because the Germans refused to pay. In other words, it was not an objectively unpayable amount that wrecked the German economy. That's just not true.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
In fact, I've even read one argument by a recent historian who said that the radical limits on the German military produced cost savings that were sufficient to cover the reparations payments.
Oh, right? No, wait a minute. Really?
Yeah. Now, the German army would have gotten smaller because it was artificially large for the war anybody else.
Yeah.
But reducing the German military to 100,000 men, that makes the German military super cheap. It means
reducing
the German
it to essentially a National Guard or a
yeah.
Home Guard.
And
Right.
so that means that has freed up, well, billions of Reichsmarks over the next few
Holy
years.
cow, this never
Right?
Well, no,
Isn't that
I didn't know
isn't that
about
an
this, and
interesting
it wouldn't
argument?
have occurred to me anyway. Yeah, that
Right
is
now, of course,
but
that,
you can't run a political campaign on that. Hey,
exactly. Look,
our weaknesses make we can pay our debts.
We're defenseless. Look at all the free money we have. Right? No, but I mean, in terms of economic reality, and the Germans claiming that we couldn't possibly pay this. Well, yeah, you can. Look at all the money you're being forced to save on your military. Now, given their freedom, they would have had a much bigger military just to defend themselves.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Right. I mean, our 100,000 is really super, super small.
Yeah,
I mean, smaller than Poland, is smaller than anybody's. Nevertheless, it is an interesting argument, right? You're claiming poverty.
Yeah.
These objective conditions prove that you're not nearly as poor as you think you are.
Wow.
Right. So that deserves to be sort of cranked into this discussion as well.
This is what when historians want to do the, I don't know, it's not a Valley Girl expression. It's some sort of other similar expression. The mind blown meme. It's this type of thing that causes that.
Sure. Well, and also, if you look, yes, Germany was a pariah state upon the signing of the Versailles Treaty, 1919-1920. It was internationally isolated, but that glass is not just half empty. You can say it's half full if you look at how quickly Germany escapes from its international isolation. It signs a treaty. Right. It signs a treaty with the Soviet Union in 1922, the Rapallo Treaty.
Okay,
which, by the way, includes provisions for the Germans to secretly escape the military restrictions of the Versailles Treaty on Soviet soil.
Well, that's
like, for example, plan and create an air force that's not allowed to have.
Yeah, so that's in diplomatic terms. That's more or less like the next day. They're already negotiating
very
these
quick.
things. Yeah.
Now,
okay.
it's a very clever treaty for both parties because the Soviets are also Soviets are also trying to get out of their international isolation. It's mutual benefit. It's classic mutual benefit. But to claim that this treaty has sort of put this in this tiny little box, and we have no contact with outsiders, and by the way, the military restrictions of Versailles are terrible. You're not isolated, and you're not even abiding by the military restrictions. In other words, you can't complain about how harsh this treaty is if you are almost immediately violating a lot of its terms, and the Allies are letting you get away with it, which is the truth. They also they signed the Locarno Treaty in 1925, which normalizes the relations with the Western Allies, paves the way for the next year them joining the League of Nations. In other words, by the late 1920s, in a lot of ways, Germany is a quote-unquote normal great power on its way to recovery. Right. Yeah, it's got these restrictions of Versailles that it's sort of chafing at. But you can't argue that by circa 1928, this is a country that's been, has a boot on its neck and it's being held to the mat by these nasty allies. That's just not the case. And yet that's how extreme German nationalists are portraying it.
Right. And that's almost exactly the sort of slanguage that Herr Hitler uses to bring himself to power.
Right. And I'll make one final argument here, which is, you can make an equally plausible argument, and I know there are problems with this, but I keep hearkening back to the discussion about the peace in America after the Civil War. But you can make a plausible argument that the Versailles Treaty was not harsh enough, which is to say,
that's interesting.
Knowing how it works out,
you
can make a case that what they should have done is they should have broken Germany up into smaller states.
Yeah. Okay.
And in other words,
a case could have been made at the time, but there's a fear,
right, that was going too hard.
Right,
that was going too far. Absolutely, because Germany did remain, in some important ways, a militarist industrial powerhouse dominating Central Europe.
Yeah.
So in the objective reality of what Germany is, despite their claims about Versailles keeping them down, the objective reality of Germany's situation in the 1920s and 30s is it is primed for a resurgence, especially if the wrong sort of people get in charge of that economic powerhouse.
Oh, okay. Right. So it's that, not Versailles, that helps lead to World War II.
Yes, and just to finish the argument, it is the Great Depression, and not Versailles, that brings the Nazis to power. Now, obviously, there are layers to this. For example, Versailles helps lead to the hyperinflation of the early 20s, which wipes out the German middle class, and a lot of those people are going to end up voting for the Nazis, right? There are some linkages there. I'm not entirely dismissing this, but pretty much Hitler doesn't come to power without a Great Depression.
Okay,
And without Hitler coming to power, you can imagine a 1930s in which Germany is a strong, maybe even assertive power, part of the multipolar international system of the 1930s, but doesn't cause World War II.
Okay, I'll have to check with the buzzlings to see what they're being taught in high school now, because they're now reaching that age. But certainly, when I was in high school, we were taught it was the treaty, was the harsh peace, and the depression.
Right. Now, it is true that people like Hitler personally is very fired up by a desire to get revenge for the Versailles Treaty and to sort of return Germany to greatness, and that means getting it out from under Versailles. I mean, that's true. That's an important motive for them. But
whether it's actually true on the ground is another story.
And is resentment of Versailles getting the Nazi Party most of its votes? Absolutely not. Say the same with the anti-Semitism, by the way. Yeah. People are voting for Hitler because they're disgusted with what they see as a failed democracy that brought about and cannot cope with the Great Depression. It's all about the Depression. The Versailles Treaty is a secondary factor at best in explaining the rise of Hitler.
Okay, well, this is a good place for us to take a station ID break, because we need to let you buzzkillers digest that, because that's one of the biggest myths we've already busted in this show. And then we'll come back and talk about other long-term significance. Back in a sec.
Hi, I'm Adrian, producer on Entertainment One's podcast network. Do you like what you hear? Check out The Reality Check, a podcast that debunks science myths you thought were true. Or if you want inspiring and honest stories that challenge the way you think about mental health, listen to So-Called Normal with Mark Hennick. You can listen to all of Entertainment One's podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, this is Lady Buzzkill. If you simply must follow my husband's deluded podcast hobby, you can also find him on Facebook, Twitter at BuzzkillProf, and Instagram at Professor Buzzkill. You might go to ProfessorBuzzkill.com if you're so inclined, and support him on Patreon. Subscribe to his email list, if you must, and shop the Buzzkill bookshelf. The only thing that seems to keep him from making more noise and frightening the horses is that the Professor Buzzkill Show is part of Entertainment One's podcast network. And of course, it's available on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, and all major podcast apps. Finally, I suppose I should thank you for listening. So, thank you for listening.
Okay, we're back. Professor, you have busted already so many myths about Versailles, both in this episode and in the when we're dealing with the U.S. and Versailles, and also in the previous episode. What other long-term significance about the treaty do we need to know? And especially, do we need to know the way it's now been understood rather than the way it was understood in the 40s and 50s?
Right, and that's important, is the historiography, right? The history that has changed. I think a long time ago, a lot more people had
changed and improved. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And once again, revisionism not being a bad word
not necessarily
in our
right,
world, not necessarily. Or usually, because that's. In fact, I just saw another post online about this, about how revisionism. That's what we do. We're constantly revising. And there's a right way and a right way and a wrong way to go about it, of course. But here,
we do the right way.
Exactly.
Other people
what
do the wrong
here?
Way.
Yes, most historians that I've seen have a much more nuanced take on Versailles, and it includes some of the innovations that Versailles brought about that are often overlooked in the larger scheme of sort of international politics and the history of the international system. It actually pointed the way to some important things that are going to happen later. For example, the Versailles Treaty introduced the concept of punishing leaders for war crimes.
Okay, well, this is fascinating to me, because I thought that, Jefferson Davis and maybe a couple of other people had been brought up, or the Andersonville people had been brought up for war crimes after the Civil War. But the real concept and the actual term doesn't come about till the Versailles Treaty.
And on this scale, you had individual perpetrators punished in the past.
Right, okay.
But also, my point here is that something we usually associate with post-World War II and like the Nuremberg Trials.
Yeah.
The way was pointed actually by the Versailles Treaty, because they never got to do it, partly because the Kaiser had fled to neutral Holland and Holland wouldn't extradite him. But the victorious Allies wanted to put Kaiser Wilhelm on trial for German war crimes. Because remember, you do have a body of international law before World War I, the Hague Conventions. And so they did want it. So the idea is there. They obviously not much came of this, but the concept is given a big boost by the Versailles Treaty. Arms control is also given a big boost by Versailles.
Now, is that Can we consider that another Wilsonian thing?
No, not just him. And by the way, you had an arms control movement before World War One. You had a big movement for like what was called arbitration.
Right.
In other words, that you settle disputes by arbitration, not by war. So you had a peace movement, by the way, that was very large and very powerful.
Oh, sure.
But after World War One, and because of Versailles, you have more serious attempts at arms control, such as, for example, the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which bans the use of poison gas and biological weapons. There was also a larger arms control and disarmament process underway at Geneva in the 20s and 30s, which didn't amount to anything.
Yeah.
But once again, this concept and its legitimacy is given a big boost by the Versailles Treaty.
Yeah, they're talking about it, and it then becomes a sort of permanent part of the conversation for 20th century.
You have to have the idea first. Right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
And Versailles often gets overlooked in this sense. Some of the territorial changes that I mentioned, these were not all just sort of by decree or by land grab. Several of these were done by plebiscite, which means the locals vote. Which country do you want to be part of?
Oh, okay. So there's not necessarily always an imposition.
No. In fact, the area of what's called Schleswig-Holstein in northern Germany,
right.
Part of it voted to stay with Denmark or to be part of Denmark. Part of it voted to stay in Germany. This is true of Silesia in the east.
Yeah. The
eastern part of Germany. They voted on whether to become part of Poland or not. That concept, I don't think that had really been tried before, certainly not on this scale. The Saar, this Saarland, the small province on the French border in western Germany, that's going to vote in 1935 to rejoin Germany after being under French control.
Wow.
So these concepts are also established by Versailles. The concept of minority protections. Remember, there's this new sensitivity toward the reality of minorities living among majorities in terms of ethnic national groups.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Minority protections in the Versailles system are in several cases established by treaty. In other words, in the treaty, there's language that you will do X, Y, Z to protect these minorities in your territory, and not just leave it up to the national government, which of course is then free to treat minorities any way they want. That's a new concept.
And could change with
the concept
government.
that you are internationally held to account for how you treat your minorities, which, by the way, long term, that's going to end up as part of the human rights regime that you see after World War II.
Oh, okay, of course, yeah.
So you have to give some props to Versailles for this. And then finally, and perhaps most obviously, is the League of Nations itself.
Yeah.
The League of Nations comes under a lot of criticism for obvious reasons. It fails in its basic task, which is to prevent World War II.
Yeah.
It fails at that. It was not a terribly effective body in a lot of ways. They did a lot of talking to not very substantive ends. I have to tell you this one anecdote. The Geneva Disarmament Conference in the early 30s, apparently it ran through 3.75 million pages of TypeScript.
When we talked about the original treaty being 1,000 pages, this is even bigger than that.
much bigger. And apparently, at the time after this figure was released, someone said the Polish and Swedish delegations could return to their countries on a path of paper produced by this
well, exactly. Yeah.
It's like if you laid out all these sheets, you could walk home.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it did a lot. It did a lot of talking and not a lot of results. But I'd point out, and this is sort of international organization 101, in an anarchic international system where there is no where states are sovereign and there's no higher authority.
Yeah, sure.
An international organization, by definition, cannot be any better than the sum of its parts, which is to say, just to lay out the obvious, if individual countries like Britain and France and Italy refuse to do what's necessary to stop aggressors in the early 1930s, that's not on the League of Nations. That's on those national governments.
Yeah, so those who blame the rise of Hitler partly on the weakness of the League, or what they see as a weakness of the League of Nations, are not really correct.
Right. In other words, the League has no independent power. It's a clearinghouse. It's a meeting place for great powers to do the great power thing.
Yeah.
But if they choose not to do it, that's not on the League. The League design actually wasn't bad. You know how I know that? If you look at the design of the United Nations, it's very similar.
Yeah. Now, and at least in terms of Western European peace, the United Nations has been a stonking success.
And it's done great things when it comes to human rights,
yes,
and peacekeeping,
absolutely.
et cetera,
Yeah.
for all of its manifest flaws. Let's be honest. Nevertheless, 1946, they fold up the League of Nations. They had to do some rebranding for obvious reasons, right? And League of Nations had a stink to it.
Yeah.
But if you look at the actual structure, the two organizations are very, very similar.
Yeah.
And that's because the original design wasn't bad. It was actually pretty clever in a lot of ways. And I think, for all of the criticism it deserves, it also deserves some praise.
No, it doesn't take long for me to get to the point when I'm talking about relatively contemporary politics to say to people that, the UN and the EU, they're the two greatest innovations in European political history, especially in terms of keeping the peace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anyway, there you go, Brexit people.
Right.
Email me at hatemail@professorbuzzkill.com.
Or to put it another way, that whole Brexit thing, how's that working out for you?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Although, stay tuned. But my final claim though would be that the story of Versailles and the legacy of Versailles are both. I'm beating this dead horse again. Are just much more complicated than they are often portrayed.
Yeah. Yeah. Seen as a glorious failure in many ways, but much more complicated than that.
Much more complicated.
Well, there you have it, Buzzkillers. Complication is our favorite thing in terms of historical analysis. So we'll talk to you next week.